Good morning, or I guess good afternoon, and welcome to the webinar on how to prepare and submit an effective preliminary or detailed site investigation report. I'm Jennifer Hansen, and I'm a Contaminated Sites Officer, and I will be presenting today. I'd like to acknowledge and welcome my colleague, Janet Beret, who will be presenting the second half of this presentation. Next slide, please. I'd like to begin by providing a general overview of the topics we will be covering in this presentation. These topics include: what are you legally required to include in your submission when preparing a preliminary site investigation or detailed site investigation report? And what are the ministry's expectations for a PSI and DSI submission? What are the main parts of your PSI or DSI reports? What resources are available to you when preparing or submitting a PSI or DSI report? Common oversights we see in PSI and DSI submissions. And finally, we will be providing an overview of the benefits you will receive if your PSI or DSI submission meets all requirements and expectations. I wanted to note the acronym PSI and DSI will be used frequently within this presentation. And PSI means preliminary site investigation, and DSI means detailed site investigation. Next slide, please. Before we move on to the requirements and expectations associated with carrying out and reporting upon PSIs and DSIs, I'd like to describe the distinction between the terms requirements and expectations within the context of this presentation. Requirements are legal imperatives, also known as a must-do. Expectations are equally important to be aware of, as they are the vehicle to meeting legal requirements and for making effective and successful applications to the ministry. Examples of requirements include conditions outlined within EMA, the CSR, within protocols, permits, approvals, or within a director's order. If any legal conditions are not met, responsible persons such as property owners or operators will be considered out of compliance. For example, if the director orders an owner or operator to carry out and submit a preliminary site investigation report for their property, this is a requirement and must be met in accordance with the timeline imposed by the decision maker. Examples of expectations can be found within the site remediation website. These examples include reference technical guidance documents, and this is supplemental information for an application. If ministry expectations are not followed, an owner or operator may have delays with processing of their applications. For example, if an applicant submits a Stage 1 PSI and the Stage 1 PSI does not include the results of a provincial site registry search, the application will be considered incomplete. Next slide, please. In order to properly understand the legal requirements, you must understand the regulatory framework for preparing and submitting a PSI and DSI report. I will begin outlining the regulatory framework with the legal definition of a site investigation. The legal definition of a site investigation is found in Part 4 of EMA, under Definitions and Interpretations. Site investigation is defined as a detailed or preliminary site investigation referred to in Section 41. Section 41 provides a detailed overview of when a site investigation will be required. It also provides information about who is responsible for the site investigation and when a site investigation will be ordered. Site disclosure statements are an important part of the site investigation process. In most cases, site investigations will be required as a consequence of being required to submit a site disclosure statement. Section 40.1 of EMA provides the legal authority for site disclosure statements. If there is a trigger to submit a site disclosure statement under EMA 40.11, then in most cases, site investigations will be required. Then in most cases, site investigations will be required and site investigations reports will have to be submitted. Another way that an owner or operator of a site might be required to undertake an investigation and submit a preliminary or detailed site investigation report is if they are ordered to do so by the director, in accordance with EMA Section 41.1. When a person does not voluntarily remediate a site they are responsible for, the government may issue a remediation order. This could occur if contamination is severe and if the contamination has the potential to harm human health or the environment. Next slide, please. In addition to the previous submission requirements mentioned, a PSI and/or DSI report may be submitted as a standalone application for ministry review, or they may be submitted as part of a larger review application, such as those seeking approval in principle of a remediation plan or an application seeking a certificate of compliance, confirming the successful remediation of a site to meet applicable environmental quality standards. You may be required to submit a standalone PSI or DSI report when triggering one of the site disclosure statement conditions outlined within EMA, or when a property owner wishes to obtain ministry approval that an investigation has been adequately carried out prior to the start and preparation of any necessary remediation plan. Perhaps the report may have been required by a director prior to that director considering the need for further orders, such as a remediation order. The same submission requirements and expectations for a PSI or DSI hold true when submitting as a standalone application or as an application for a certificate of compliance or an approval in principle. Next slide, please. Before we proceed to describing preliminary and detailed site investigation in more detail, let's take a moment to remind ourselves how a contaminated site is defined. Section 39(1) of the Environmental Management Act defines a contaminated site as an area of the land in which the soil, groundwater, surface water, or the underlying sediment contains a prescribed substance in concentrations exceeding prescribed risk-based standards or prescribed numerical standards. It is important to understand that Section 11 of the Contaminated Sites Regulation prescribes the standards applicable to determining when a site is legally a contaminated site. Specifically, this is when the numerical standards are exceeded for substances prescribed in Schedule 3.1 to 3.4 at the concentrations specified in those schedules. Vapor, depicted on the graph of this slide, means gaseous emissions from soil, sediment, or water. Next slide, please. A site investigation is a process with which an investigator determines if there is a risk or potential or actual contamination on a property. Responsible persons can undertake site investigation without regulatory oversight, but it must be carried out by an experienced, qualified professional. Next slide, please. The site investigation process is implemented in stages. It is an iterative process whereby initial data is successfully supplemented by newer and/or more focused studies. The first stage, a stage 1 preliminary site investigation, is a desktop and historical review that is typically non-intrusive in nature and does not include a sampling and analysis component. The stage 1 PSI involves a review and assessment of all relevant information about the site. This includes site historical use and any records available to determine the likelihood that current or previous site operations or impacts from neighboring properties may have contaminated the site. The investigation should identify all past and present potentially contaminating activities, identify potential contamination types, discuss the site condition, provide a preliminary assessment of site contamination, and assess the need for further investigations. Section 58 of the CSR outlines what is required for a preliminary site investigation when ordered by a director, or in the context of an investigation triggered under the site identification process. If a potential for contamination is determined, the areas of potential environmental concern, APEX, and potential contaminants of concern, PCOCs, should be identified. Next slide, please. An extensive component of the stage 1 PSI process involves the review and assessment of property-related records about the site. The type of information reviewed includes historical site plans and diagrams, city directories, topographic maps, provincial and federal database records, fire insurance records, land title searches, and aerial photographs. This is not an exhaustive list of the information that should be reviewed for a complete stage 1 PSI. Next slide, please. Other important components of the stage 1 PSI include the site visit and interviews. The site visit is conducted by a qualified professional trained to identify possible environmental issues on the site. The site visit is a visual reconnaissance that should include gathering information on current site or business activities, topography, site vegetation, stained soil or asphalt, drainage systems, hazardous materials, tanks, storage containers, signs of contamination, and information on neighboring properties. The site inspection is very detailed, and this is not an exhaustive list of the information that is collected. Interviews are conducted with former owners, current occupants, neighbors, and any other people who may know about the history of the site and surrounding properties. Next slide, please. Technical Guidance Document 10 provides a summary of the general types of information expected by the Ministry in Stage 1 PSIs. Technical Guidance 10 provides a link to a checklist which highlights the important features of a complete Stage 1 PSI. Technical Guidance 10 should be considered as guidance only. Some features are legally required, but not all are relevant in all cases. Environmental consultants and others using the checklist when conducting and reviewing PSIs should also consider site-specific factors. Next slide, please. The final portion of a complete Stage 1 PSI is the preparation of the report. The report summarizes the findings from the desktop review, the site visit, and the interviews. The report should identify all past and present potentially contaminating activities, identify potential contamination types, discuss the site conditions, provide a preliminary assessment of site contamination, and assess the need for further investigations. Where a complete site history clearly demonstrates that site activities are unlikely to have introduced contamination and are not listed on Schedule 2 of the CSR, there may be no need for further investigation or site sampling. However, where contaminating activities are suspected or known to have occurred, or if the site history is incomplete, it may be necessary to undertake a preliminary sampling and analysis program at the Stage 1 PSI. In this case, the Stage 1 PSI report should identify the on and off site areas of potential environmental concern and associated potential contaminants of concern. These areas will be the focus of the next stage of the site investigation process, the Stage 2 PSI, where a complete site history, review, and site reconnaissance clearly demonstrates that the site activities are unlikely to have caused contamination. There may be no need for further investigations, such as a Stage 2 PSI. Next slide, please. The Ministry does not expect that the extent of contamination will be delineated at the completion of a Stage 1 PSI. It is, however, required that a qualified professional or approved professional will have conducted the site reconnaissance. In addition, it is expected that all information about which potential substances may be causing contamination on the site is collected. However, at the preliminary site investigation stage, most of the time, no sampling is required. Next slide, please. Let's take a moment in the presentation to pause and consider the following questions the Ministry would like to present to you. Contemplate the answers privately. Please do not answer within the chat feature of the webinar and choose all that apply. So question 1, should site investigations only be undertaken with direct oversight by the ministry? So the answer is B, false. Site investigation is carried out independently by qualified professionals. Next slide, please. Question 2 is, what must be demonstrated in an application containing a preliminary or detailed site investigation report before it is considered by the director? Remember, choose all that apply. I'll just give everybody a couple of seconds here to contemplate their answers. And okay, so next, please. So the answer is C, A and B. The question was developed in reference to Section 63 of the CSR regarding demonstrable experience of a qualified professionals and professional statements. Janet Bure will be presenting the remainder of the topics on how to prepare and submit an effective preliminary or detailed site investigation report. Janet?
Next slide, please. Thank you, Jennifer. Next, I will talk about Stage 2 preliminary site investigations. If the findings of a Stage 1 PSI identify areas of potential environmental concern, the investigation process will move to a second stage of preliminary site investigation, or Stage 2 PSI. The Stage 2 PSI is conducted to determine if potential contaminants identified in the Stage 1 PSI are present at concentrations that exceed the Contaminated Sites Regulation standards. The investigation is typically intrusive, involving field assessments and sampling of relevant environmental media. Section 58 of the Contaminated Sites Regulation outlines what is required for Stage 2 preliminary site investigations. At the beginning stages of the site investigation process, an initial conceptual site model, or CSM, should be developed. For effective planning of any site investigation, the physical, chemical, and biological processes that control the transport, migration, and actual or potential impact of contamination should be drawn together into a conceptual site model. The CSM should be developed at the outset of the investigative process and refined throughout the course of the investigation to strengthen and clarify the site understanding. I will discuss the CSM in more detail in a later slide. Next slide, please. The second stage of a preliminary site investigation includes many components. First, a review of the Stage 1 PSI and current site uses conducted. The location of utilities on the site needs to be determined, and any necessary permits need to be obtained. The fieldwork process typically involves completion of test pits, drilling of boreholes, installation of monitoring wells, and collection of samples of relevant media, which may include soil, groundwater, vapor, surface water, and/or sediment. After fieldwork, the samples are chemically analyzed by a qualified laboratory. Next slide, please. After samples are analyzed in the laboratory, analytical results are compared to the applicable Contaminated Sites Regulation standards to determine if contamination is present on the site. This allows for determination of the general location and degree of contamination. Areas of environmental concern and contaminants of concern are identified based on locations where samples exceed the applicable CSR standards. If contamination is found, the ministry does not expect that the extent of contamination will be delineated upon completion of a Stage 2 PSI. A Stage 2 PSI is also not likely to contain enough information to prepare an estimate for remediation. At this point, the site investigation process continues forward with the next stage, the detailed site investigation, Next slide, please. If a Stage 2 PSI identifies contamination on the site, a detailed site investigation, or DSI, is the next phase of investigation to be completed. A DSI builds on the findings from the Stage 2 PSI. The purpose of the DSI is to determine the full extent and magnitude of contamination identified during the Stage 2 site investigations. Multiple investigations may be required before the extent and magnitude of contamination is fully understood. Ultimately, at the completion of investigations, a comprehensive CSM should have been developed. Section 59 of the Contaminated Sites Regulation outlines what is expected for detailed site investigations. This is important information regarding requirements of the DSI. Next slide, please. A DSI report can be extensive, depending on the nature and extent of contamination at the site. Typical components of a DSI report include, but are not limited to, the following: regulatory setting, describing the Contaminated Sites Regulation standards applicable at the site, a description of the stratigraphy and hydrogeology of the site, methodologies employed during fieldwork, analytical results and discussion, tables of analytical results, figures showing investigative locations and analytical results, and a summary and conclusions section. Next slide, please. A DSI determines the extent and magnitude of contamination at the site. This involves investigating and delineating the lateral and vertical extent of contamination associated with the areas of environmental concern identified in the Stage 2 PSI. Contamination is evaluated relative to the Contaminated Sites Regulation numerical standards, and the information gathered in a DSI must be sufficient to develop a remediation plan and/or a human health and environmental risk assessment. Next slide, please. Technical Guidance Document 11 provides a summary of the general types of information expected in a Stage 2 PSI and a DSI. Technical Guidance Document 11 provides a link to a checklist, which highlights the important features of a complete Stage 2 PSI and DSI. This should be considered as guidance only. Some features are legally required, but not all are relevant in all cases. Next slide, please. For a complete DSI, it is expected that a qualified professional or approved professional will have sampled all relevant environmental media and all substances that are causing or threaten to cause adverse effects on human health or the environment are reported. In addition, the ministry expects analyzed substance concentrations to be reported relative to the CSR standards applicable at the site. At the completion of a DSI, the ministry expects that the extent of contamination will be delineated. A complete DSI will also identify whether off-site migration has occurred, and if so, the lateral and vertical extents of the off-site contamination will be delineated. Next slide, please. As I previously discussed, the iterative site investigation process allows for the development of a complete conceptual site model, or CSM. A conceptual site model is a visual representation and written description of the relationships between the physical, chemical, and biological processes at a site and the human and environmental receptors. The CSM should tell the story of how the site became contaminated, how the contamination was and is transported, where the contamination will end up, and whom it may affect. The CSM should evolve as new information becomes available. A CSM should provide information on the sources, types, and extent of the contamination, its release and transport mechanisms, possible subsurface migration pathways, as well as potential receptors and the routes of exposure. The CSM must be supported with a data set derived from sound investigative practices. Depending on the level of site complexity, the CSM may be portrayed together with descriptive text in a set of plan maps and stratigraphic cross-sections or fence diagrams. Next slide, please. In preparing a preliminary site investigation and/or detailed site investigation report, there are many ministry protocols and guidance documents that may provide assistance to ensure that the application is as complete as possible. This slide shows the protocols and technical guidance documents relevant to the preparation of site investigation reports. Links for all information can be found on the site remediation website address shown at the bottom of this slide. The relevant documents are found at the Technical Guidance webpage and the Legislation and Protocols webpage. Next slide, please. Ministry reviewers may encounter errors and omissions when conducting reviews of site investigation reports. If this is the case, the errors and omissions need to be identified in their reviews. Wherever possible, the ministry reviewer will provide an opportunity for applicants to provide additional information to clarify, correct, and/or resolve the situation. This slide outlines some common challenges that ministry reviewers have identified in site investigation reports submitted to the ministry. To reduce the review times of the ministry, please do the following. First, for a site investigation to be complete, the areas of potential environmental concern and the potential contaminants of concern must all be identified. The sampling program needs to include the collection of an adequate number of samples to support the investigation conclusions. The DSI needs to include sufficient data to support a risk assessment where applicable. And adequate quality assurance and quality control measures need to be undertaken during fieldwork to ensure collection of meaningful and scientifically credible samples. Ensure you follow the BC Field Sampling Manual and Environmental Laboratory Manual. There's a talk tomorrow morning on these ENV policies. In summary, do enough work to have a low degree of uncertainty and a high degree of confidence in order to meet regulatory requirements. Next slide, please. This slide shows some common challenges we see in site investigations with respect to groundwater delineation, fate, and transport. Lateral and/or vertical delineation of groundwater contamination needs to be complete at the DSI stage. The ministry's Technical Guidance Document 8 provides guidance to ensure that contaminant plumes are identified and characterized with reasonable certainty. Sampling density needs to be sufficient to capture worst-case concentrations. The qualified professional should consider the possibility of diving groundwater plumes where applicable. And deviation from Technical Guidance Document 8 must be identified together with adequate supporting rationale and consequent implications on the uncertainty of the acquired data set. Next slide, please. Some additional common challenges with respect to groundwater include reliance exclusively on groundwater flow software analysis, the omission of groundwater investigation in cases where groundwater is deep. This situation does not preclude groundwater investigation from being necessary. And finally, inadequate investigation of bedrock. Evaluating the nature and extent of groundwater contamination within a bedrock aquifer is complicated and expensive. However, where necessary, bedrock needs to be adequately investigated. Advice of a qualified professional should be obtained to plan and conduct a bedrock investigation. Next slide, please. This slide outlines some common challenges that we see regarding vapor in site investigations submitted to the ministry. The correct use of vapor attenuation factors and adequate identification of worst-case conditions is important. Temporal sampling needs to be adequately performed to determine seasonal variation. Performance verification plans must be provided where applicable. And soil vapor needs to be sampled at the appropriate depth for the future parkade. Next slide, please. Benefits of providing a complete package with all the necessary information when you put an application forward are provided on this slide. If the application and supporting information meet all the requirements and expectations when it is initially provided, it will likely result in a quicker turnaround time. It may also potentially save money for the client because it will eliminate the need for the ministry to request additional information. Additional information requests could result in added site investigation costs and/or report preparation costs. Ministry review team efficiency will be enhanced if the information requirements of CSR 59 for a DSI are met. Following CSR 59 will ensure that the information necessary to represent the site conditions clearly is provided. This will support the review team, making their job easier and also resulting in the benefits already discussed. Note that the ministry may ask for paper copies of figures, tables, and reports if needed. Next slide, please. In closing, here is a summary of what we discussed today. What is legally required to include when submitting a PSI or DSI report to the ministry, what the main components of a PSI and DSI report typically are, what resources are available to you when preparing or submitting a PSI or DSI report, common challenges encountered by the ministry in PSI or DSI reports, and finally, what benefits there are to submitting a complete PSI or DSI report. Thank you.